Hustle over everything. Mark or take one.
What common threads do you consistently see with couples who were once in love but are no longer there?
It's just one thing. Oh, wow. That's a question that I don't think I've ever been asked.
So doing prenuptials, right? Do you get to look at couples and be like, they're not going to work, and them, they're probably going to work? Do you see that difference?
Then one day I get an email that says we actually broke up, called off the engagement. The wedding was literally like 2 weeks away. It was crazy. But the expectation has to be that if you're married to this person, they are a joint partner in this venture that you guys have together. And as a consequence, they are entitled to half of everything that you earn and own.
Hello and welcome to Hustle Over Everything. This is the podcast for business and culture. Now, today we're on the cultural side talking about marriage. Now, we have Toronto divorce lawyer Justin Lee in the building to talk about it. It's going to be a really interesting conversation, so make sure you stick towards the end because we get to a very interesting point towards the end. All right, if you like this conversation, make sure you hit subscribe as well. It's an important aspect of watching us on YouTube. If you're on Spotify, make sure you hit follow as well. All right, let's get into the show. This podcast is brought to you by Whit Media Studios. Justin, what's going on with you, bro? How you doing? You good?
I'm great now that I'm here with you.
Awesome. So to get things started, I want to ask, what parts of how you were raised contributed to what you do now?
Oh, wow. That's a question that I don't think I've ever been asked. Well, I think if you want to be in family law or divorce law, depending on where you are, you might call it one or the other. You have to care about people, right? If you're a lawyer and you had motives that are not about serving people, there are many other things that you can do other than family law. Family law certainly don't pay you the most. It's certainly not the most prestigious area of law. And so for you to be in family law, I'd say you need to have that innate sense of wanting to help people. That was probably instilled in me, right? As I grew up with my parents, they also had a lot of that sort of care towards others mentality that I would think probably contributed a lot to me being here today.
That's real. I want this conversation to be preventative. Our audience is young men between the ages 25 to 35, predominantly. And a lot of us are getting into that stage and are looking like, all right, how do I not be an asshole? How do I not look into the future and be proactive? I really want to get to the weeds with you when it comes to what you see, because you're dealing with the people that are, ripping each other's hearts out at that level where it's becoming all business, no more love. What common threads do you consistently see with couples who were once in love but are no longer there?
It's just one thing. They are, at certain point, they stop treating each other like they are each other's priorities, right? At one point, they probably would have done everything for that person, right? Like to reference Bruno Mars, they would probably catch a grenade for that person and do whatever. But I just realized I don't have that many reference to Bruno Mars tracks than I thought.
He kind of fell off a little bit over the last few years.
Well, I mean, and then he came back with that Lady Gaga song, and then he dropped that song with
Sexy Red.
Yes, and
that wasn't it.
Oh no, I saw that. I was like, whoa.
Bruno.
I don't know about this direction.
Exactly.
No, but I mean, everybody gets married at some point because I would assume that they can see a future with this person,
of course,
and that they are convinced, at least at the time, that they are the person that is their best fit. And a part of that, I would also assume, is they know that they would be treated right by their partner, and vice versa, that they would treat the other person right and prioritize them over everything else. At a certain point, that is no longer the case. Whether that's because you have children, and you start to look after the children, and you sort of lose that sort of need to give the other person the same kind of attention and care, or even without kids, just passage of time, they realize that they're just not each other's, or I think more commonly they just get too comfortable, right? People don't like to think that an end of a marriage is a possibility for them, right? I mean, obviously, consciously, we all know that it exists. Divorce is a thing. And people already know, like 50% of marriages all end in a divorce. And so they know it's a very real possibility. But for their own marriage, I don't think people ever acknowledge it as something that can actually happen. And what happens when you don't ever think that something you've got can ever be lost? You take it for granted, right? Like a good example that I always use is, why do most people perform at work? You like your job maybe, but for most of us, it's because if you don't perform, you're not going to have that job anymore. There's consequences to not putting in the effort, right? Marriage is no different. And in fact, the consequences are more dire. And I think you have to put in a lot more effort towards your relationship than an employment would require. But it's just the way that we've been either programmed or just naturally think about marriage. We don't ever think of it as something that we can lose. And so you start to treat each other terribly. You start to not buy them flowers on, anniversaries or Valentine's Day, what have you. And that has consequences, So it's, what can we, what can we do about that? The fact, I suppose, is, have a real sort of shift in the culture, right? From thinking that a happily ever after is what we are, is what we want, to a difficult and a challenging lifetime journey and a quest to try and be there for one another, but at the same time, the most rewarding journey that you can ever take. Two very different things.
What you touched on culture. What do you think the culture is now when it comes to marriage? What do you think the overall difference between what's done in public versus what's actually happening in real life? Because the reason why I reached out to you is because I could easily reach out to a couples therapist, but I realize that a lot of couples therapists get lied to, right? But as a divorce lawyer, you get to see the real, because people have client privilege, so they can keep it real honest with you versus something like a couples therapist where they're speaking with the partner, right?
Yeah.
So what is the difference between what's the narrative culturally versus what's actually happening among the overall clientele that you're seeing?
I think we already kind of touched on that, right? Like the culture is, marriage is end all be all.
Got you.
Marriage is this like very sacred institution that we have to protect, and it is very coveted, and everybody strives to one day reach that sort of phase in their life. But the reality is that people don't treat it as such, right? Like they don't treat it as something that is actually that grand, something that is that significant in your life, It's not something that's just going to fall in your lap, right? And it's not something that you can keep just because you happen to be, married to somebody. It's like it's eternal work. But I think that's the disconnect, right? People don't realize just how much work it takes to maintain it.
I agree. And I think the challenge that the guys have is that they see providing for their wife as providing monetarily, when there's a whole bunch of buckets that come with that provision. Is that a consistent thing that you're seeing when it comes to your male clients? Because, and I don't want you, of course, to expose any of your clients on a specific level, but I was watching your podcast, and I saw one guy say that he was blindsided or felt blindsided. And I have members of my friends and family who've also said that they've gotten blindsided.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, is there a consistent trend there of men feeling blindsided by their marriage? And could that be from those buckets not being filled?
Yeah, there's a huge cultural element to that, and a societal sort of pressure on men to perform a certain way in a relationship, and vice versa for women too. And both genders are probably misunderstood, right? Like men, maybe not. Maybe it's changing a little bit now, but I mean, it's always been the case that like the idea of being a man in a relationship was, as you said, providing monetarily. So you're the one that goes out and works, and if you can't earn a certain amount of income for your family to be comfortable, you're not qualified to be a suitor as a man. But I mean, to a certain extent, monetary sort of abundance is important, but I don't think, like, if you ask most divorced or separated women, wives, and mothers, I don't think they would say that that's what they would have wanted from their partners, from their husbands. I don't think they would say, that's what I wanted my husband to be, a bank account, right? I think most of them would say, I wanted them to be around. I wanted them to be a literal partner, human to human. If I need to vent and have this emotional connection with you, you're there for me, right? Maybe you're not making as money as you could outside. If you had to sort of be at home more often, maybe you have to pass off some promotions. And that would sort of impact our standard of living on a material level. But I think most of them would say they don't. That's not what they care about. If their basic needs are met, I think most of them would say, I wanted you to be around for the kids, for me. Do the dishes once in a while. Clean the home with me, right? Let's go on vacations together. Let's have a chat. Let's go out on a date night. But to be fair to men, I think most of them probably function in that way because they don't know better, right? I mean, even today, like, you see the social media and like how much of this rhetoric do you see that, like, if you're a man and you don't drive a fancy car and you don't make a six-figure income, that you're not qualified to be anything. It's everywhere. I mean, like for myself, who's not so young in my adolescence anymore, like, I can sort of see through that and then see how I can be critical towards that kind of rhetoric that's out there. But if you're a young, adolescent boy and you're looking at that, like, no wonder you're going to grow up to think like the only way that I can serve anybody in a relationship is to work hard at my job, make a lot of money, and shower them with gifts and all this monetary, services. So
that's real. I don't know if are you familiar with James Sexton?
Yes, of course. Yes,
yeah,
of course.
Yeah. He brought up this metaphor of a granola bar in a cabinet.
Because you do. When you're a divorce lawyer, you spend a lot of time with people and you get to know them very well. I mean, people will lie to their therapist. They won't lie to their divorce lawyer because A, there's no reason to, and B, I need to know everything, and it's all attorney-client privilege. And this woman, we were sitting outside the courtroom waiting on a break in testimony. And she was a young woman in her probably like late 30s, very attractive. And we were just chit-chatting, and I said to her, was there a moment when you realized the marriage is over? Like, was there a moment? And she said, yeah. And I said, when was it? And she said, there was this granola that I like. She said, they only sold it at like this particular grocery store, and I like to put it in my yogurt. And she said, he used to always, whenever I'd be running low on it, I would just open the thing one day and a new bag would be there. She's like, and she's like, it made me feel so loved. Like, I didn't have to ask. He didn't want credit for it. Like he didn't go like, oh, did you see? I got your granola that you wanted. You know, like he just would do this thing, you know? And she said it was just something that like, it always made me smile. She said every time the granola was running low and there was a new bag of granola, I just felt very loved, you know? And she said one day the granola ran out. And I thought, oh, that's weird. You know, maybe he didn't see it. She's like, so I left the bag in there because I thought, well, at some point he'll notice. And he didn't notice. She goes, so I took the bag out and I waited and he didn't get a new bag. And I thought, okay, this thing's going down. And I thought to myself, wow, that's like, you know, that's such a small thing, like granola. Like you just, but these are the things, like these are the little things that make us feel loved and that are gestures of love. And when I said to her, was there anything like,
you know, is that what you're seeing as well, where it comes down to a few specific things in the relationship where the guy was doing it before and then he drops the ball on it kind of thing? Or is it more of a once he does a specific thing, the whole relationship falls apart?
No. It's rarely the case that there's a one sort of event that makes the whole thing fall apart. Even if something really like dramatic happens, like somebody, you know, has an affair, usually it's the case that there's a lot of sort of history and nuance of the relationship that's been sort of building up to that point that led to the affair, let's say. And those are really just culmination of very like little things. You know, they start with a very small misunderstanding. They start with a very sort of subtle frustration, you know, just negative emotions towards the other person that never gets addressed. They grow and grow and grow, and they grow exponentially. And eventually something happens that people would categorize as something that would have ended the relationship, but really it's not. Like that event is just a symptom of like a more pervasive issue that's been present in the relationship for a lot longer than you think. Yeah, so I don't think it's ever. Rarely is it the case that there was one thing that happened one day, and that's what, you know, made the relationship fall apart.
Now, I'm gonna go back into your story a little bit more. Did you experience divorce in your families growing up, or?
Not in my family.
Okay.
No. You know, and you know, it's funny because the reason why, I mean, a lot of family lawyers actually do get in the industry because they have that experience and they know how difficult it is, and they know, well, and they now want to sort of serve people who might find themselves in a similar situation because they just know how tough it is and what have you. For me, it's not as serious, but it's the truth. Like I got into divorce law because I just love relationships, interpersonal dynamics, and you know, I went to law school. It was my first year. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and there was a program that allowed you to explore family law, and I remember thinking, like, how funny would it be for me to be able to tell my friends that I'm in divorce law? And I thought to myself, it'd be kind of like, you know how, you know, your friends would talk to you about or vent to you about problems they have with their significant others. And if they go through a breakup, then you're like right there listening to all of it. But as a third person, it's really entertaining for you. I remember thinking it's like the same thing, except I get paid a lot of money to do it. So like that's the reason why that's what got me into divorce law. But obviously a lot of other things are the reason why I stayed in it. A lot more noble reasons than me just being a nosy person in other people's relationships. But yeah.
Got you, man. So it started off as an ironic statement. I got you. Have you ever seen couples reconcile after divorce?
Yeah. It's not often. Because like, you can imagine, like you have to sort of think about, you have to understand at what point in their quote unquote separation do they come to my office and actually have a chat with me.
Yeah.
Usually a lot of things would need to happen before they get to that point. Sometimes it's marriage counseling. Sometimes it's no sort of sometimes it's not therapy, but they really have to think hard about whether they genuinely want to go through with separating with their significant other before they pay me money to talk to me for an hour and talk about what options they have if they do want to officially separate from this person. So usually by that time you're done. There's no you've reached a point of no return. Yeah, but it does happen. It does happen, and it happens. I remember a client that was deep into the separation. Lawyers were involved. We were in the midst of settlement talks, and the file's been going on for a while, and there were a lot of different issues that you would never think that these people had any chance of reconciling. But one day I got a random email that just said, "By the way, we're back together.
Wow.
Thank you for all your time."
In the middle of settlements.
Yeah.
Damn. So you're just like, all right, well, pay the check and we're good to go.
Yeah. And look, it's funny because actually the law requires that the lawyers try and encourage the parties to reconcile.
How do you
That's
do that?
part of the law.
How do you do that?
Well, you just have to talk to them and say, look, I mean, is there a chance of reconciliation here? You have to check with. It's a bit silly, in my opinion. I think it's very outdated. I assume it was put in place way back when they were trying to disincentivize divorces as much as possible. But nowadays, I think that does more harm than good. Trying to see if people who have made up their minds about separating, whether they would like to reconcile. Because a lot of the times we have issues like domestic violence.
Yeah.
And yet the law says we have to still check whether they want to reconcile. It was I remember a client that was a victim of a horrible domestic violence incident. And the other lawyer calls me up and they, frankly speaking, they had the audacity to ask if my client had any sort of intentions to reconcile with her ex-spouse. And I'm thinking, how does this make sense on any level? To ask a victim of a domestic violence whether they would like to get back together with their ex.
You know what I think? I think as a society, we've become very accustomed to domestic violence. I'll give you an example. And this is so random, but when Drake was going against Kendrick, right? Kendrick had one statement, Drake had another. They had two theses to go against each other. One was pedophilia, and the other one was domestic violence, right? When Drake said, "Hey, you beat your wife," everyone was like, but you're a pedophile, so that's way worse.
Yeah.
And collectively, it felt like there was a,
Yeah.
They're still together?
Happens. Yeah,
it happens.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's so interesting. Nobody really batted an eye if he was a domestic abuser or not and didn't look into it or nothing. Drake got fully investigated. You could tell Drake was getting investigated. And everyone was like, hey, what's his history like?
Yeah.
Pulling up past concerts, pulling up everything like, is this true?
Yeah.
We need to look at it. And justifiably so.
Yeah.
But the fact that no one even really looked into Kendrick was a very telling sign of where we are society-wise.
Yeah.
And with going through all those situations, how do you look at love? How do you look at marriage?
How do I personally or how do I professionally?
I want to hear both.
Because the answer is different depending on who you ask. The divorce lawyer, Justin, or me as in my personal capacity. Look, professionally, I have an obligation to try and mitigate your risks. Okay. And love is an emotion that will put you in very, very dangerous and vulnerable situations. There's just no way around it. And so as a professional, my official answer has to be love is just an emotion. Love is not going to sustain your marriage. The success of a marriage is going to depend on compatibility, alignment on values, to a certain extent, how much discrepancy there are in terms of your respective financial situations, et cetera, et cetera. All the sort of checklists that you can come up with to see if you're the right fit with this person. And if love is a relevant factor on that list, it's going to be it's going to be very low on that list. But personally, I'm a hopeless romantic, man.
That's interesting.
Like love is, and I think that's part of the reason why I'm in this field too. Because I can appreciate that, human relationships are, on one hand, very beautiful. It's intricate. It's very complex. But that's what I get joy out of, like working with the sort of interpersonal dynamics and what used to be love. That's not love anymore, what have you. So, but for me personally, yeah, love is everything. I allow love to sort of cloud my judgment. I had to learn over the years that, depending on who I'm, giving that love to, I could be either blessed with a reciprocal love and treatment, or I could be really putting myself in a very, vulnerable position and get hurt. Mm-hmm. But that's never changed sort of the way I view love personally, which is that it's something to prioritize. Yeah.
Very interesting. Especially someone that's in it to still be a hopeless romantic is a big statement.
Yeah, no, like people always ask me, the number one question I get is like, are you not jaded as a divorce lawyer?
Of course.
Like, do you still believe in love?
Yeah.
Yeah, and to their surprise, my answer has always been like, always.
Interesting. Because I feel like you and bartenders have the same kind of experience where you're seeing like one predominant side, but at the same time, you do a lot of prenuptials.
Yes.
So you get to see the beforehand of people getting married, right? So doing prenuptials, right? Do you get to look at couples and be like, they're not going to work, and them, they're probably going to work? Do you see that difference?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't have the empirical data. Like I haven't done a prenuptial agreement, or many of them, like 30 years ago, for me to know whether or not my predictions as to whether they would be still together 30 years later is right or wrong. So I don't have that data. But they definitely do fall in two very distinct camps. One is it's seamless, it's frictionless. Agreeing on what to put on a prenuptial agreement. In Canada, by the way, we call it a marriage contract. Prenuptial agreement is an American term.
Oh,
and given what's happening with the U.S. right now, perhaps we should stop using the American
it.
terms.
Yeah. You gotta put our own media, for sure.
But on prenups, it just has a nice ring to it, so we'll keep using it. But coming up with the agreement and discussing what to put on, because you have to remember, even in that process, the two of you are adversaries, at least in that process of coming up with an agreement. Because at the end of the day, if I put in a term that benefits me, it's going to directly go against your interests. It's just a math, right, in a prenuptial agreement. And so, and you can see how then it can be difficult for some people to come to a settlement or come to terms with what to put on that agreement. But so one camp is you have people who are just so agreeable, and I would suggest to them, I would suggest terms to put in there to protect their own interests, and they would be the one to tell me, like, you know what, I get what you're saying, and I appreciate that you're trying to protect my interests, but that's not what I want to do, because I know that's unfair for my partner, and I would actually want to lower, quote unquote, the protections that you're offering me to benefit my partner, and vice versa. And so those agreements will literally take like a month or two, very quick, a couple of revisions back and forth.
A month or two is quick.
Oh, very quick. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, we can talk about that too. We can talk about
I didn't know that.
Yeah, we can talk about what's actually involved in an agreement, so we can understand, and other people can understand why. A month or two, if you can do it in that time, you've lucked out. But But yeah, so that's one camp: frictionless, effortless, and people who genuinely want to do what's right by each other. And then you have the second camp where they want to put terms in the agreement that is clearly one-sided, right? So, here's like you have to understand the nature of a marriage contract or prenup is not a contract that's going to protect you necessarily, right? Because an agreement has two parties. If it only protected you, it would not be a fair agreement. Really, what the agreement is it's a document, it's an agreement between two people that they both agree is in their mutual interest, right? But then you have people who will try and put everything in the agreement that is clearly just one-sided, and they're going to screw the other person. A classic example is somebody who is making $300,000 a year, and their partner is unemployed. They're about to have a kid. The unemployed spouse is going to be the caregiver for the children. Yet that person tells me, I want to put a term in there that says if we happen to separate, there is nothing I will give to the father or the mother of my child. That's not a fair term, and that's not something that I would think someone who cares about the other person genuinely would want in an agreement like that. And so there have been a couple of instances actually where couples like that came to me and got in the middle of drafting an agreement, and then one day I get an email that says we actually broke up, called off the engagement. The wedding was literally like 2 weeks away. It was crazy. Yeah. But then they said, in the process of coming up with this agreement, I realized I wasn't marrying who I thought I was marrying.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, if people are still hesitant about getting a marriage contract,
it's actually a good way to vet your person before.
100%. 100%.
Interesting.
100%. It's kind of like, you're going to see if that person is going to put their money where their mouth is.
Mm-hmm.
They say they care about you. They say they love you. They say they will do anything for you. Well, we'll see about that. Seriously, right? Like,
yeah.
What is and we're not asking for anything unreasonable either, right? Like we're saying, look, if I'm going to be, bearing your children, I'm giving birth to them, and I have to sacrifice my own career so that we can have a family and so that you can continue to go out and work and continue to, progress your career. Yet you say to me, in the event that we separate, I'm not going to get anything out of that. That's not fair, right?
Yeah. That is interesting. Okay, so you mentioned that it takes a month or 2 months to usually carry a prenuptial agreement. So then what's the average? That's a short time. What's the average?
Well, I mean, average speaking in average in family law is so difficult because family law it's not cookie cutter at all. Every case is so different. So it's hard to give you an average, but we always say, if you want to get a marriage contract, you have to, at the very least, get a lawyer 3 months before your wedding. That's the minimum amount of time that we require for us to feel comfortable in coming up with a fair agreement and doing proper due diligence. Yeah, so 3 months, it's not really an answer to your question, but 3 months is like the bare minimum that you should give yourself and your partner to actually getting a lawyer to do this process for you.
Got you.
Yeah.
What do you think most interviewers should ask you about getting married that they don't ask you?
Oh. I think they need to think long and hard about, first of all, like, how they foresee their relationship and their dynamic and the family arrangement, right? And a lot of because that's going to have a significant impact on where you'll probably end up, legally speaking, in terms of what you are entitled from the other person or what you're obligated to give to the other person, and where your vulnerabilities are, like how much risk you're taking on by being in that position 5 years out, 10 years out, right? Like think about that. And then ask me directly, like, if this is the scenario 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, like, what am I looking at? Because without that kind of projection, all I can do really is to just give them the general information about what usually happens in a divorce, what the law says, and how it might impact you based on your circumstances right now. But I don't know what you're going to be like in 15 years.
I probably don't know what I'm going to be like in 15 years.
You have a better idea than I do, right?
Facts.
Yeah. So but I think that also kind of ties into an important point, which is I don't think enough people think long term. Right? Like, I think even when it comes to marrying this person that you're about to marry, I think it's rarely the case that they say to them, they have a realistic sort of discussion by themselves or with their partner about love aside. Ironically, because I could probably use this advice myself. Love aside, given all the compatibility factors and the realities of being two individual humans who promise to dedicate their lives to one another, what situation am I going to find myself in 10 years down the line? Like, what is a probable outcome in this relationship? And marry based on that sort of long-term projection, right? Will this person realistically still be good for me 20 years down the line? I don't think that's a question that most people would sort of have an honest sort of answer to. I think more likely people marry because in the moment they're in love, in the moment everything's great, in the moment it makes sense. But not a lot of thought given to, but like realistically long term, am I doing the right thing?
Interesting. Now let's talk about money, because that's one of the biggest parts of prenuptial, postnuptial, getting married, getting divorced, everything, right? Because one of the big reasons for divorce is the money. What should guys know going into a marriage money-wise to start?
As soon as you are married, your expectation has to be that half of everything, both your assets and your income, is going to be shared with the other person. Now, the outcome might not be that. The outcome might be that it's actually far less than having to give up half of your assets and your income. But the expectation has to be that if you're married to this person, they are a joint partner in this venture that you guys have together. And as a consequence, they are entitled to half of everything that you earn and own. And I say that because once you have that expectation, when the reality hits, like you actually go through a separation and you're having to look at what it is that you're having to shell out to the other person, you've probably expected the worst, right? And it's probably not as bad as you were expecting it to be. And it's not, but at the same time, it's not a unrealistic expectation either, right? if you're married long enough and the circumstances are just right, like that's exactly what's going to happen. Give up half of everything you own, and 50 cents on every dollar that you earn is going to your spouse. You know, it's a possibility.
And it's vice versa too. If she's making that much money, he can take half as well.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that is quite not common knowledge, but it feels like it's common knowledge, right? But it feels like every time that happens, it still feels like a smack in the face, right?
But that's again, I think we're all privy to that information.
Yeah.
We're all privy to that knowledge.
Yeah.
But we never think to apply it to ourselves.
Yeah, it's almost like health. It's almost like health. It's like, yeah, I know a lot of guys are getting testicular cancer, but and if it happens because they have polyester boxers, but I'm gonna these polyester boxers anyways.
Yeah.
And if it happens, it happens. If it don't, it don't.
Yeah.
It's like, okay. So of course the provisional aspect of it, or the proactive aspect of it is getting a prenuptial agreement, of course. But
no, I mean look at the number of doctors that smoke. Very good at giving advices about what not to do, but like when it comes to their own body, it's a different story, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
And that brings up a good point, because I hear doctors make horrible people when it comes to divorce. Is that true?
Look, I mean, I don't want to generalize.
I'm here to generalize today.
But no, look, I think it's just, I think partly it is true, but that's not a criticism of them at all, right? Like, if you think about doctors, they literally save lives.
Literally.
I think there are very few professions out there that are more noble than being a physician. And what comes with that is a great sense of sort of pride that you take up this space in the society where people look up to you. You literally give life-saving advice. You literally save people. And so you get accustomed to being the one that knows everything, being the one to give advice. But even the smartest doctors, when it comes to getting a divorce, they don't know, and of course they don't. Like, that's not their job, right? And that's the divorce lawyer's job. And so they get told a lot of stuff that they don't want to hear, and they don't agree to, and that just doesn't make sense in their head.
Mm-hmm. It's like the biggest pattern interrupt.
Exactly.
It's like, I've been right up with 1,000 things, literally giving life-saving advice, being right in the heat of battle, in the heat of a life-saving moment. Like, all right, get the thing to save this person's life. And for the first time in their life, they're saying, no.
Exactly.
You cannot get what you want.
Exactly.
So it's almost like you're dealing with a child, because it's like it's a temper tantrum.
Exactly. And divorce is very, very emotional. Like, and just how emotional it can get. The example that I always use is, I remember a client that was a lawyer themselves. And you would think that lawyers, out of anybody else, would understand that a court order is not something to be breached. You have to follow a court order. Yet you have this lawyer who's breaching orders left, right, and center because they're so emotionally driven, right? And that just goes to show just how emotional divorce can be for most people.
Where have you seen the depths of humanity go in the middle of divorce? Like, what's some of the examples you've seen?
Oh my God! I mean, this is an example that happens way too often. But look, we have people who literally remortgage their homes. They sell the only real estate that they own to fund their litigation. They'll sell their house that they've worked their entire lives to save up for and give all of that money to their lawyer just so they can have a day in court. I mean, if that's not irrational and purely driven by emotions, I don't know what is, right? Look, but I mean, there are certain cases where that's just inevitable. Like, if you have if you have a case that you have to be in court for, and there are just certain things that you cannot give up, most notably, custody of a child, that's different. But if you're in court for, things that are not that significant to you, especially money issues, like if you are spending more money on your lawyers than you stand to gain by whatever you can win in that courtroom, like that's not a rational decision, right? So
Very interesting. Now, this is going to sound a little off center, but I remember hearing about this soccer star who put the assets that he has
oh yes, I remember that,
in
yes.
his mom's name. Is that something you advise as a lawyer?
Oh my gosh. So look, one thing you have to understand, I'm an Ontario divorce lawyer, which means that I practice Ontario law. And each province is going to have their own different laws about how to deal with property in Canada. And obviously with other countries, like I couldn't even begin to tell you how they deal with divorce in general, right? So I can only speak to what Ontario is like.
Mm-hmm.
Ontario has a pretty comprehensive set of laws to capture any kind of instances that somebody might have tried to sort of game the system, so to speak, right? If you're thinking about hiding your assets so you can protect yourself in a divorce, and however creative you think you're being, I promise you're not the first one that's tried. And the law in Ontario will recognize any kind of property that really, even if it's legally not yours, but realistically it's yours, will treat that property as something to be divided in a divorce.
Really?
Yeah. So if I recall correctly, that soccer player was Moroccan.
Yes.
So I don't know.
His name was Akraf Hakimi.
Yeah.
And Hibu Abuk.
Yeah.
Hibu Abuk. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a lot of names, but I think that's him. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't know about Moroccan law, so like
Gotcha,
maybe
so it's a
there.
little bit different.
But here, it's not gonna fly.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what if property is in a corporation?
Same thing. If you have an
you
interest,
can break the corporate veil.
100%. If you have an interest in the corporation, and same thing, right? If you see a divorce coming down the pipeline, and so you're like, oh shoot, I'm going to transfer my corporation to another person or another corporation, and you try and sort of evade your responsibilities that way, it's still going to catch up to you. Yeah.
How does big lawyer money to small lawyer money actually play out in Canadian legal divorce?
Explain that to me. What do you mean big lawyer money, small lawyer money?
Just like that. Like I make $500,000 a year, so I can afford a top lawyer versus I make $60K a year. So
I see.
I'm affording a middle everyday lawyer.
Yeah.
How does that actually play out in reality?
Well, there's a few different ways I can attack that question. But I think what you're asking is like realistically, what's the difference between hiring $1,000 per hour lawyer versus a $150 per hour lawyer? In family law, at least in my experience, seniority doesn't necessarily mean that you are good at what you do. It just means you've been doing it for a long time. And for some people, that experience definitely carries them well, and they're a lot more qualified because of that experience. Others, I sometimes question how they've been in business for that long, and that's just me being truthful, right? And vice versa. There are young lawyers who are extremely capable, even though they only have a year or two of experience. And I mean, and obviously, if for most young lawyers, they're going to be not as competent, let's say. Mm-hmm. But the sweet spot really is in the middle, I think, right? And I'll give you an exact number. Like if you're hiring somebody who is charging over $300, you're likely going to get somebody who knows what they're doing. The instance and if you think about like that diminishing returns graph, there's a point somewhere where like the more money you give to the lawyer is not going to yield that much that proportionate amount
Result.
of sort of competence and service and quality.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say that point is probably around the 300 to 330 mark.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Now, there are lawyers who charge a lot more than that, obviously, up in the, I think I've seen literally $1,000 an hour for a family lawyer. Those lawyers are usually reserved for folks that can afford them. And look, I mean, if for those people who money is not really an object, and then for them spending the extra $700 on a lawyer, even though the return in the quality and the competence that you may receive is not proportionate, may be worth it to them, right? And for cases that are extremely complex, that you just don't see often, as a family lawyer, those cases might require that kind of level of expertise. But be prepared to spend a lot of money if you're going down that route.
You bring up a point about with money not being an object, right? But a lot of people get divorced that don't have money as the object, right? So what are the secondary reasons people get divorced? Is it just the time that you see? Like, I would love to kind of set parameters for the guys that are getting into marriage to think, all right, if I stop doing this, I already know it's probably going to go down a bad path, right? So for the guys who have money, that isn't an issue now. Is this the tension that's happening that you see, or is it something deeper than that usually?
I think passage of time, but we got to qualify that, right? Because it's not just a passage of time; it's passage of time with you not putting in the effort. And that's just a cliche line, like you put in the effort or not put in the effort, but it's so true, and that's really that's what it comes down to, like, are you treating that like, ask yourself honestly, if you're in a relationship, are you treating that person the same way you've treated them in the first 6 months of your relationship? I think if you're really honest with yourself, most people are going to answer no.
Now, do you ever see people actually get blindsided where they are treating the person right, and the person just says they haven't done anything wrong to me, but I'm just don't want to do it?
Yeah.
Really?
I think I see that often too. But here's the thing.
Often?
Yeah, but here's the thing. They think that they've been putting in the effort. They wholeheartedly believe that that's what they've been doing, and that they've been doing everything right. But from the other person's perspective, that's not, either it wasn't enough, or it just wasn't the right type of effort. Kind of goes back to our initial point, that very normal for a guy to think like, I'm bringing you home $500,000 a year. I bought you this mansion that we're living in. We have 3 different cars. We have a nanny. We go on expensive vacations twice a year. Like, what do you mean I haven't done enough for you? And the other person says, that's not what I wanted from you. That's not why I married you. You weren't here for me when I needed you most. When I was feeling down, like, were you there for me emotionally? Did you change the kids' diapers once in a while I've been doing all of that every day for you? Et cetera, right? So I think it's actually mostly the case that one person thinks like that they've done all the right things, but it wasn't the right type of thing for the other person.
The right type of thing. Now, of course, time is a big one. And of course, you're saying the vacations, the money, the mansions. But what I guess, is a glaring thing to me is love languages. Because there can be guys who don't do the whole gift thing, because of course there's always going to be the guy who's just I shower with gifts, which is the laziest way to love possible, right? You know, it's literally just like buying love off Amazon, right? But then there's guys who will actually put effort into building something with their bare hands or fixing things across the house. And that's still not contribute because that's not that person's direct love language, right? So now, have you seen that as well, where they're not rich necessarily, but they're still giving in the time and effort, and it still results in divorce?
Oh yeah, I mean, I have plenty of clients who are not, you know, financially well off, and so for them that, you know, monetarily, you know, wowing that person was never really an option, and so, you know, for them the effort was, you know, in form of services and care, let's say. I mean, ironically, I think for some of those couples, the disconnect was probably, you know, I really appreciate everything that you're doing for me physically and service-wise, but we need more money. You know, that happens. Look, I mean, it's fair. Look, money's important. Of course, know, like this discussion. Obviously, you know, we've been, you know, we talked about the rhetoric online being that toxic masculinity, where you have to make a lot of money for you to be recognized as a competent male and what have you. But look, money's important. Money's important, and so, and I don't fault anybody for. Deciding to break up with the other person for financial reasons. That's entirely in their own right. And look, that might not be fair to you. And if you just don't have the financial capabilities to meet that person's like financial needs, and that person says, therefore, I don't want to be with you, it's incredibly painful to be in that situation. But I also think that's fair. Look, like you have complete freedom over whether you want to stay with your significant other, and as does the other person. And it doesn't have to be for any kind of valid reason.
Yeah. Right? What's the usual financial situation? Is it just that they're not making enough, or is it like we're underwater kind of thing? Because I think there's a difference between someone who's just like, I'm more ambitious in my monetary goals versus someone who is, we're underwater. Like we are, we're facing homelessness, and we need to separate so we can like get our lives together. And those are two completely different things, right? How do you see those things play out?
I think it's both. You see some cases where like the other person, for whatever reason, refuses to financially contribute. And so in that case, I'm thinking of a case right now where, you know, one spouse refused to work for many years, and basically the other spouse had to support the entire family on income that's not that high, and they had a couple of kids, and so, you know, you can imagine the expenses are high, and so they were probably in the red for a very long time. You know, and they separated because, I mean, how long can you sustain that for? And, you know, and for the spouse that's bringing in the money, they probably don't want to feel like they have to feed, you know, the children as well as the adult in the room. I mean, don't want to sound too crass about that, but like that's how they feel, and I can understand where they're coming from, right? But there are other cases where they both are gainfully employed, but one spouse, and usually I see this in the wife being the much more high income earner than the husband. I suspect they start to see their husband as not as admirable
because she's earning less.
Because she, I think it's more that she is making so much more than him. And I think it is still true, despite the shift in this gigantic shift that we've had in our culture towards equality and feminism. I think it is still true that women tend to want to look up to their partner.
Hypergamy is still real.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
That's interesting. And it's interesting to hear that coming from you specifically. Because especially in the Black community, there's a huge notion. Right now, Black women are out earning men dramatically, unfortunately. So there's a notion that as long as they're being treated right, they're fine. You know. But what you're saying is that hypergamy is very real, that if their earning potential gets to a specific point, that resentment starts to build.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, you think about it from the husband's point of view too, right? Like, I can totally understand a husband who is earning substantially less than their wife.
Feeling like shit.
Feeling emasculated.
Yeah.
You know? And like I said, like, despite all this shift in culture that we had towards equality and you know, this breaking down this cultural sort of norms that the man has to be the breadwinner, I think that still exists, right? Because like,
see now, hold on, sorry to cut you off.
Yeah,
but it's interesting because from what you're saying, it's a huge conundrum for a guy, because you're saying on one end, if you spend too much time working, that you just leave her and not spend enough time. But if you don't spend enough time working, then there can be a resentment that builds because you're not making enough money. So there's a tug of war that's naturally felt as a guy, where you feel like you can't win on either front.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think balance is always the answer to everything, right? You know, swinging too far to one end and refusing to work, to be there for your family, is probably not the answer.
Yeah.
Not being there for your families just so you can make a lot of money is probably not the answer, right? So somewhere in the middle. But the difficulty, of course, is this, irrespective of whether you've achieved that balance or not, it still might be the case that your wife is earning substantially more than you, and so you feel emasculated. I mean, I think the answer is you have to be a secure person, right? And it goes both ways. Like, you have to, as a woman, you have to be okay with a man who makes less than you. And as a man, you have to be okay with having a woman making more than you. But obviously, it's much easier said than done.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not just about the money, right? Like, this you know, taking on a masculine role and a feminine role within a relationship, it's not just about the money.
It's the dynamic.
Right? Exactly. So, you know, like what's a masculine thing to do? Let's say opening the door for, you know, your significant other as a man, for your woman. This is like this is your chivalry, right? And it's a chivalrous gesture, opening the door. But I can see how, if you feel insecure about your income compared to hers, suddenly you being chivalrous feels a little bit like, not because as a man you're taking care of your woman, but you're almost like serving her because she is above you, so to speak. Right? So I can see that dynamic.
Because it's almost like when you're earning more, you're taking care of the person, and chivalry is a form of taking care of that person.
Exactly.
But when the person's earning more, it becomes a form of servitude to that
person. Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, and you can start to then see how, like, it's all very intertwined.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what makes human relationships so complex and in a way intriguing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. For sure. Now, as a businessman, you know, one of the biggest things that we're told is the best investment you can make is your wife, right? How do you see? It's interesting because I used to have a client that owned a boutique, a men's fashion store, and he was married to his wife, and they brought it up together. Then they divorced, and they still ran the company together,
Wow,
divorced,
it's rare.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
How do you see couples that build business together? Because I find that as a big thing, and I see a lot of times right now, even especially in my community, couples building business together.
Yeah.
How do they walk into that marriage prenuptial wise if they're going to be 50-50 split, but of course going to grow? Like, yeah, I'd love to get your opinion on that.
I mean, at the end of the day, what's right for you is going to be different than what's right for somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
There's really no one cookie cutter answer to any kind of situation that you might be in. But it's really the solution has to be tailored to you and your partner and the relationship that you have. The key is communication. Like, you really, really have to communicate with one another and have difficult conversations. Not just about how are we going to run this business. Are we okay to do this well as spouses who are married? But like, I'm talking have the difficult conversation. For example, if we fundamentally disagree about the direction of this company, how are we going to resolve the dispute? Okay. If we're both at work, some emergency happens at home, who's the first one to go home to check up on the emergency, or for the kids, or what have you, right? Who's going to be the one to make the sacrifice in that professional working relationship? Because we're spouses, right? Those are not easy discussions, but the more that you can spend time having that difficult conversation with one another, the more that you can come out ahead of whatever issues you may face. And believe me, you will face a lot of issues. Like having a co-CEO or being a co-founder of a company in and of itself is very, very difficult.
What? Tell me.
Imagine being a spouse on top of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And having kids.
Yeah. Co-founders get their head cut off.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can only imagine. And it creates so much more buckets in that relationship. You have the kid bucket, the parent bucket, you have the date bucket, romance, dealing with in-laws.
Yeah.
And then dealing with being able to amicably work together on top of that.
Yeah.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious to get your opinion on the faults of a relationship. And I actually want to go into speak to more of the personal, Justin. How do you approach faults in a relationship? Because as someone who sees divorce all the time, you get to see where there's consistent faults in people, right? But everyone has faults, right? It's impossible to have a perfect partner. How do you maneuver through that?
I have a good answer for this. Yeah. And this actually comes from my personal experience too. And I mean, partly professionally, I suppose. But when you ask for an answer from the personal side of me, so I'll give you my personal answer. You're right. Nobody's perfect. Everybody's going to have faults. Whenever that fault manifests itself in a relationship, in whatever form, whether that be a fight or however you can imagine faults can manifest in your relationship, your initial instinct and your only instinct has to be to own up to it. You have to take accountability. Even if you think it's the other person's fault, you have to point your finger inwards, right? Because first of all, it's very rarely the case that one person is ever completely at fault. It's usually a mixture of both. They sway in percentages, depending on the circumstance, but rarely the case it's strictly the other person's fault. But I say that you always have to point your finger inwards, and you have to sort of own up to, quote unquote, the fault, because the response you will get is one of two things. One is they will bash you for the fault that you just owned up to. And they will also point their finger at you and make you out to be the source of the problem. The second response is acknowledgement and appreciation of the fact that you had sort of taken the higher road, so to speak, and you had sort of taken accountability for what you may have done. And they also reciprocate that effort by saying, I also recognize that I had some fault in that too. And I apologize for that, let's say, right? In first case, you have a situation where where one person, at least one person in that relationship, is looking to point their finger at you. They're trying to make you into the bad person. They're trying to look for things that are wrong with you, right? And they have no sense of the reality that even if you were, in fact, somewhat at fault, you probably also had a bit of part in that too. But with the second example, you have a relationship where both people are trying to meet each other. They genuinely want to understand each other, and they genuinely want to position themselves against whatever the problem is that they're facing together, not each other, right? The problem isn't them. The problem isn't within one of them, right? There is a problem, but it's a problem that the two of you can face together and work on resolving as a team, as opposed to adversaries, right? And so if you find yourself in that situation and you always point your finger inwards, as I say, and the other person happens to fall in the first camp where they sort of build onto that and then they also point their finger at you, might I respectfully suggest that you're probably with the wrong person? And I'm just being very frank with you, right? Because I see that a lot in divorces, right? The blame game never stops. They can never take accountability. They can never admit that they also were probably part of the problem, even though not entirely or even mostly. And that relationship was probably never going to succeed in the way that they were treating each other.
Because of the pointing.
Yeah. But as soon as you have as soon as you have a relationship where both people are, they want to work together as a team, then you know your likelihood of success is probably a lot higher, right?
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. As we're wrapping up, I want to touch a little bit more on culture.
It's important. I think that's a big theme in a lot of your podcast episodes.
Yeah. We operate at the intersection of business and culture. You know, and you're Korean.
Yes.
How does Korean culture affect marriage?
Oh, I mean, look, East Asian societies, they frown upon divorce a lot. Once you're in, you're in. It's a disgrace to the family, not just you, not just your immediate family, your entire extended family.
Oh wow!
It's not looked upon as something that's good. It's not a positive thing. It's looked as a failure. But it's not just my culture, right? Like that's
a lot of
probably
cultures.
That's probably most other cultures other than the North American. But even then, the North American culture, still look upon divorce as something that's not positive, even though in terms of sort of the intensity at which the culture sort of does that, it's not as bad as Korea or other cultures. But it's a really, really harmful cultural norm that we have.
Because more people can be in marriages unhappy.
I mean, unhappy is just scratching the surface. Like, I'm worried about people who are in dangerous relationships, right? Like, I'll give you an example. It blew my mind. You know, I had a client who was a terrible, victim of terrible domestic violence, and I'm preparing to do all this stuff, to go to court, to seek to get her some help and what have you. But even in the midst of all that, I get on a call with their family members, and they tell me that their immediate families are still trying to convince them to not go through with this because of the disgrace that it would bring to their family. And I'm thinking,
she might die.
like, quite literally.
Yeah.
But that just goes to show just how sort of pervasively harmful, just this cultural norm that we might operate in, that no matter what happens, you have to stay in your marriage. It's not just when you're unhappy. Even when you're beat up by your spouse, you have to try and stick it out because of your family's reputation. Crazy to me. Yeah. And it happens a lot, by the way. It happens a lot.
Yeah. Wow. I did not know that.
And here's the thing, the critics of what I just said usually will say something along the lines of, well, we don't want to make divorce something that's so accessible. We don't want the divorce rate to be 99%, for example. Like, we don't want it to be this thing that's so normalized that we'll have single parents everywhere and, children who don't grow up in a normal nuclear home. And my response to that is, anybody that can appreciate the amount of stuff, the turmoil that they had to go through to get to the point of wanting to get a divorce in the first place would know that even if divorce was made the most accessible thing in the world, it was the most normalized thing, it's not as if people would start getting a divorce just because they can, People who end up in my office have genuinely thought long and hard about whether they want to go through with that or not. And by the way, they have a lot to lose. We're talking about people who have, for the last 20 years, have been supported financially by their spouse. We're talking about somebody whose entire identity is literally being a wife and a mother, or a husband and a father. We're talking about people who will have to, for the first time in 20 years, get a job as a cashier somewhere, as a 50-year-old adult. Talking about somebody who, for the first time in 20 years, will have to go out and present themselves in their society as someone different than what they used to be for the last 20 years, right? Like, that's the kind of sort of price they have to pay to come to my office and say, what can I do in my situation to get a divorce, right? So if anybody thinks just because we make divorce more normalized that people will start getting a divorce left, right, and center, I can't begin to tell you how wrong they are,
Very real. I think that's a beautiful point to end on. As your podcast wrapping up, where can people find you?
A couple of different places. If you're in Ontario and you need to speak with a family lawyer, you can go to my website. It's jleefamily.com. That's JLEE family.com. If you just want some bite-sized socials, just some, we call it edutainment, I think. Educational, but still entertaining content about divorce, marriage, relationships. I'm on TikTok at jleejd. That's JLEEJD. And on Instagram at jlee.jd.
That being said, after the podcast, hustle what you can control. So control your grind and control your life.